Hello and welcome everybody, this is Grandmaster Sam Shankland and I'm here to continue my series on Elite in Development and how to use it and what goes on with all that. So this is my second video in the series. In the first video we saw the last round of the Olympiad with Hikaru playing black against Mamedyarov. So that was half the reason we lost the match, that he lost that game. And the other half of the reason that we lost the match was that I failed to beat Altaj Safarli from a very strong position. And actually, that game also had a lot to do with a lead in development, and I actually got a big one and should have won, but I didn't effectively use it. So I'd like to show this game as well. I think it was very instructive, and I'm hopeful that you'll learn something from it. So this game started off as a Najdorf, and I should point out that I was on very, very good form this tournament. I had 8.5 points out of 9 so far. It was the best result of my life by far, and I winning the gold medal for board 5. I was a little bit surprised that I played so poorly in this game, but I went in very confident. So knight f3, d6, pretty quickly we ended up in a Najdorf. Now after knight g4, I didn't really feel like playing bishop g5, so I repeated the position once before deciding to continue the game with f3. Of course, I didn't want to just make a draw with white. So queen b6, and now I played sort of a weird move, bishop e2. I think much more normal is knight b3, but bishop e2 always made some sense to me. And now black thought for a while and played knight c6, a move I think is not best. And here, it makes a lot of sense. He's developing a new piece, he's putting a little bit of pressure on my center. But here we're going to see I was willing to give away a pawn for a nice lead in development. So I played bishop e3, strong move. White is willing to give away the b2 pawn to get a nice lead in development. Now, black kind of has to take right now because he's going to lose his opportunity to otherwise. And if he plays a move like queen c7 after queen d2, this is just an excellent Sicilian for white because queen b6, queen c7 leaves a lot to be desired. So queen takes b2. And at this point, white must play knight a4. There's basically nothing else to it. And after queen b4 check, which is kind of forced, queen a3 was originally the move I was more concerned about because after c3, knight takes d4 and say bishop takes d4, e5. I thought black was going to do okay. This bishop has to move away, and then black plays b5 and kicking the knight. I could get myself into some trouble. But I noticed that here, because black has put his queen on such a precarious place, actually white doesn't take the knight. He simply plays bishop c1 and the queen is trapped. So after c3, black would be in big trouble, actually. It's not easy at all to stop bishop c1. His only move is b5, but then after, there's several good moves. But I like knight takes b5, it's the easiest. Takes. And once again, black's queen is in big trouble, and the c6 knight is hanging. So black chose queen b4 check instead, and after c3, queen a5. At this point, there's no doubt black is not losing anything concrete here. There's nothing, he's not just getting crushed, he's got a reasonably solid position, his king is safe. But what he has done is he's fallen well behind on development by playing queen b6 to b2 to b4 to a5. So with his lead in development, the question becomes, how should white continue? And remember, like I said in the beginning, a lead in development is a dynamic advantage that you want to do something concrete with because ultimately, if you let your opponent develop their pieces, the advantage will disappear. So here we have to look for the weaknesses in black's camp and ways to start making problems. And pretty quickly you realize that this knight on a4 is not very good and it would love to jump into b6, which calls attention to the exchange. Knight takes c6, b takes c6, knight b6. Keep in mind, this is very energetic play, and here black is unable to actually develop his pieces with a move like e6 or g6 to get his bishop on f8 out. He's got to waste more time because his rook is hanging on a8. So after rook b8, knight takes c8, rook takes c8, more problems arise for black following the move queen b3. This is a very strong move. White is bringing out another piece with a threat. He wants to play queen b7, which would win a pawn and cause a lot of problems in black's position. This is very tough for black to deal with as well, because there's not a real good way to defend it. If you play rook c7, then bishop b6 is kind of crushing. So all the while, white is developing with threats, which makes his lead in development grow even more. So queen c7 was my opponent's choice. And now I could have taken this pawn for sure, but after rook b8, I'm starting to lose a little bit of time and say I move my queen, I don't know, maybe to a4, and black plays g6. He's going to get bishop g7 and castle in. And still, I would think white should be better here with the bishop pair on the outside past pawn, but nonetheless, I could probably get more. So I started with the move rook b1. And now this move carries a threat, because now white would really like to play bishop takes a6, since he doesn't have to worry about rook b8. For instance, let's say black were to try to develop his pieces now. g6. e6 is also possible, and it meets a similar fate. Here, after bishop takes a6, again, white is getting his stuff done and making threats. Here is, first of all, he's equalized the pawns. But after rook a8, we're seeing bishop b7, and now this rook is in big trouble. It's got no squares. It can't go to a6 or a7. All these squares are unavailable. Its only squares are b8, d8, and a5. For rook a5, bishop b6. For rook b8, bishop a7. All this way, black is just losing time. And after something like rook d8 and say I play simple queen b6, I'm going to take the pawn on c6, and white will be a pawn to the good as well as have an advantage in development. So here what we're seeing is white was sort of crashing through and starting to crush black because his lead in development was growing, he found the weaknesses, and he started to target them. g6 was a bad move. Black played the best move, which is a really, really sad one, rook a8. The problem now is he's just not developing his pieces. He's played in this game queen b6, queen b2, queen b4, queen a5, queen c7, as well as rook b8 to c8 to a8. That's not very inspired. So it's unsurprising that white has picked up a big lead in development. So here, again though, it's a little bit annoying. If white just continues nonchalantly with something like castles, g6, it's not that easy to improve his pieces, and black is going to play bishop g7 and castle. And if white does nothing, ultimately black will have an extra pawn. So white has to do something a little bit more concrete, and he does with the move queen b7, aiming to jump in on the open file. So queen takes b7, rook takes b7, and now black has several ways to develop the bishop, but he chose g6, which generally I think is the best way to do it in this position. King f2, bishop g7, and rook hb1. This is reasonably simple chess. But here, black once again is unable to continue developing because what he'd really like to do is castle, but then he's losing a pawn on e7, which is going to ruin his day. So he plays the move e6, which is clearly preparing to castle. And this is the point where I started to falter. Here is where I made a bad move. So what I'd like everyone to do is pause their videos and think to themselves, what should white do? And see if you can come up with a good move. Okay, so if you want more time, please keep your videos paused. You should clearly be looking for the weaknesses in black's position, and all of these pawns are just sort of dropping like flies. The first move I considered was rook b8 check, aiming to do some bad things on the back couple ranks after something like rook takes b8, rook takes b8, king e7. I have several pleasant options here. Rook takes h8, bishop takes h8, bishop takes a6 is the simplest, when white is left with a bishop pair and an outside passed pawn in the endgame, which should be very, very good. I'm sure there's even better than that. But what I was unconvinced by was black playing king e7 and leaving this tension and hope to keep a rook on a8 defending the pawn. And he's ready to meet rook 1 b7 check with knight d7, and as long as black doesn't see any ghosts, he's going to be fine here. There's no real threats. So I basically decided rook b8 check wasn't especially effective, and I wanted to attack these pawns. The next move I thought about was rook b6. It seemed like I'm bringing my worst placed rook from b1 into b6, where I'm attacking both the a6 and c6 pawns. The d6 pawn could come under pressure too, and black's position really seems to be falling apart. But I rejected this on account of the move d5, which I didn't really want to see because after e takes d5, knight takes d5, black is starting to attack my stuff, and if e5, knight d7. I'd really like to play the move f4 here to solidify my center before taking pawns, but unfortunately I can't because this rook on b6 is hanging. Nonetheless, rook b6 was the best move because I had discarded an idea that I shouldn't have really discarded. And that's that after d5, now that black has advanced this, my previous idea of rook b8 check makes a lot more sense because black is unable to play this defensive try king e7 that would bother me before, specifically because he has advanced d5. This has weakened him on this diagonal, and after bishop c5 check, he finds himself checkmated. So as a result here, actually after rook b6, d5 is nothing to be scared of because rook b8 check should win the game without a ton of discussion. In fact, even after something like takes, king e7, still rook b7 check, and this king has to come back since knight d7 fails to something like bishop c5 check. So rook 1 b6 was the way to go. And this is natural. When you have a lead in development, you want to bring in your worst placed piece. It kind of goes back to the previous series where you have to think about what is my worst place piece and where the weakness is. And here, while all of white's pieces are pretty good, the worst one is probably the rook on b1. It wants to come into b7, kind of like the other rook. But ultimately, I played the move rook c7, which is, I think, quite a bit less accurate, because after castles, rook takes c6, d5. If you can imagine, we would have had this exact same position, except the b1 rook on b7, if I had played rook b6. Let's say, going back to rook 1, b6, castles, rook takes c6, d5. Here, we see a key difference, which is after e5, the problem for black is that his knight cannot go to d7, which is its best square. So after rook c7, castle, rook takes c6, d5, e5, knight d7, f4. There's no doubt white is still clearly better here, but I've lost a lot of my advantage. Here, my development advantage is pretty much gone. Black's next move is rook fc8, and now his pieces are looking pretty good and active. Maybe not active, but his pieces are out just the same as mine are. So I will have played rook a1 to b1 to b7 to c7 to c6, only to exchange it off for a rook that only moved once. That's how my lead in development disappeared. Now, nonetheless, white is better here due to black's passive bishop on g7 and weakened queenside pawns, but it's a lot less than it could have been. So I continued rook takes c8, bishop d4 to save the c3 pawn, f6. And here white could have preserved very good winning chances with a simple move like rook b7, just trying to maintain his strong space in the center and keep black from activating his pieces. After f takes e5, black is unable to capture the pawn on e5 with either minor piece. If bishop takes e5, rook takes d7, and if knight takes e5, rook takes g7. In both cases, white is winning. So black will have to play something like knight c5. I can't do king e3 there, I'm hanging my rook. But after something like rook e7 first and king e3 next, I think white's going to end up doing pretty well. So that was correct. Instead, I tried to calculate it all to the end with bishop takes a6, which is wrong. And I'd calculated this well, but not perfectly. And if you're going to go into tactical lines, you should always have a pretty good idea of what you're doing. So rook a8, bishop b5. And here I thought I was doing really well, because once this knight moves, e takes f6 is coming. And after rook takes a2 check, king g3, of course I realized he's going to play f takes e5. But I thought after bishop d7 and bishop e6 check, black is sort of falling apart. So king f8, and now I thought rook b7 was kind of game over because rook f7 check is going to hurt, but I missed black's strong next move, and here the game quickly fizzled out to a draw. So rook e2 is correct. He's not fearing the discovered check. Rook f7 check, king g8. Of course, black can't play king e8, because after rook g7, rook e6, and cd4, white is up a pawn, and this rook endgame should be winning without a ton of discussion. But after king g8, white is left without much. So bishop takes d5, rook e3 check, king f2, rook takes c3. And again, black is just not afraid of the discovered check. He's just going to go back and forth. All of his pieces are on defended squares, so he doesn't have anything loose that will fall off the board. And as a result, this game is drawn. And while I would say bishop takes a6 in this endgame was the mistake I made that really allowed black to hold the game, when after rook b7, white still had very serious chances. The mistake I'd like to focus on really is this move rook c7, where I did not use my lead in development in the most effective way because I used a piece that I had already developed to a really good square, rook b1 to b7, instead of another piece, which was not quite as active, to achieve my goals of attacking these pawns. And now, granted, I did this with very concrete reasons in mind, but they turned out to be wrong, and no matter what you're talking about, what part of chess, whether it be a lead in development like we're talking about in this video, or a space advantage like I've talked about, or bishop pair or anything, you always have to remember that ultimately calculation is going to be part of everything you do, and if you calculate something and it just doesn't work, that's something that you have to live with. In any case, I think this was a good example of how to play with the lead in developments, and I was very disappointed not to win the game, of course, but I learned a lot from it, and I hope you did too. So thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Sam Shankland, and have a good day.